February 27, 2030. The Obsidian Grand Ballroom in Atlanta wore its finest skin that Friday evening chandeliers scattering light across 400 faces who believed they knew exactly how the night would end. They were wrong about that, along with several other assumptions they had made over the years about quiet women and the empires built in silence. Thaddeus Sterling stood near the podium in a navy suit tailored specifically for this occasion, silver watch catching light each time he gestured. At 39, he had cultivated the precise posture of a man who belonged in rooms like this, which was interesting considering every brick in the foundation beneath him had been laid by someone else's hands. His smile held the practiced warmth of someone who had spent years learning which expressions opened which doors. Beside him, Sloane Cartwright adjusted the neckline of her gold dress with fingers that trembled just enough to betray nervousness beneath the confidence she projected. 30 years old and polished in the way certain women are polished when every detail has been carefully assembled for a specific purpose. Her hand found Thaddeus's arm and settled there with the proprietary grip of someone claiming territory. The room hummed with the low murmur of wealth discussing itself. Old Atlanta money mingled with new energy fortunes, political donors clustered near the bar, business leaders compared notes on quarterly projections. Live stream cameras positioned at 3 angles fed video to over 2,000 viewers who had contributed to campaigns and causes and now expected entertainment for their investment. Table 12 sat near the back of the ballroom, close enough to the emergency exit that someone seated there could leave without causing disruption. The table arrangement itself told a story for anyone who understood the language of social architecture. Tables 1 through 5 commanded the front position to signal importance. Table 12 existed in that liminal space where invitation and dismissal occupied the same square footage. Genevieve Whitmore sat at table 12 in a burgundy gown she had worn to her 8th wedding anniversary back when anniversaries still meant something other than calendar marks counting down to an ending. The dress moved like old money when she breathed fabric that knew how to drape without announcing its price. Her only jewelry was a thin gold bracelet worn smooth from 60 years of being worn by 2 women who understood that some things are more valuable because of what they carry than because of what they cost. She had arrived at 8, directed to her seat by staff who avoided eye contact, the kind of avoidance that happens when people have been instructed not to acknowledge someone's presence. Guests whispered as she passed, "Isn't that Thad's ex-wife? Why would she come, poor thing, sitting back there alone?" The whispers held the particular satisfaction of people watching someone else's humiliation, grateful it wasn't theirs. Genevieve heard every word. She always did. The trick was deciding which words deserved the power of a response and which deserved the more devastating gift of being ignored entirely. At the main table, Cordelia Sterling surveyed her work with the serene confidence of a woman who believed she had orchestrated every relevant variable. 67 years old and sharp in the way that women get sharp when they have spent decades arranging the world to reflect their preferences. Her pearl necklace caught light each time she turned her head, and she turned her head often, ensuring the cameras captured her best angles. The evening had been planned with military precision. Speeches at 8:45. Thaddeus's announcement at 9. Champagne toast immediately after. Then dinner dancing, and the comfortable conclusion of watching someone who had built everything from nothing return to nothing, while 400 witnesses confirmed the narrative that Cordelia had been carefully constructing for 3 years. What Cordelia did not know, what none of the 400 guests pressing champagne flutes to lips painted in this season's colors could possibly know, was that at exactly 4:47 that afternoon, the woman sitting quietly at table 12 had signed her name to a document that would rewrite every assumption currently operating in this ballroom. But that revelation sat 3 hours in the future. First, there were other stories that needed telling. Stories that began 21 years earlier in rural Georgia, where money was scarce and compasses pointed north, and a grandmother with tired feet and sharp eyes made a decision that would eventually destroy a man who believed he could not be destroyed. The mind has a way of reaching backward when the present becomes unbearable, and Genevieve's mind reached back now to a kitchen table in 2009, to the last conversation she had with Eloise Whitmore before cancer took what months of treatment could not save. Lola had been small even before illness carved away what weight she could not afford to lose. 74 years old, and every one of those years visible in the lines that mapped her face like roads on old atlases, each crease a journey taken without asking permission. Her hands shook when she poured coffee, but they steadied when she opened the thin envelope containing everything she had saved in 42 years of carrying plates to people who did not always see her as entirely human. $28,000. Tips accumulated $1 at a time, folded into envelopes hidden in coffee cans, deposited in accounts that earned interest so slowly the growth felt more like faith than mathematics. Every dollar represented a choice. Comfort now or possibility later. New shoes or granddaughter's future. The easy thing or the right thing. Lola slid the envelope across scarred wood worn smooth by decades of elbows and homework and meals stretched to feed more people than the budget allowed. Her voice carried this particular weight of someone saying something they had thought about for a very long time. Buy something with your name on the deed, Evie. Not your heart on someone's promise, not your hope on someone's potential. Something legal, something nobody can take from you. Not a man, not a family, not a company. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Genevieve had nodded, 18 years old and bright-eyed in the way people are bright-eyed when they have not yet learned how many things in this world are specifically designed to dim them. She understood, or thought she did. The full comprehension would come later in ways that would break her heart, and then rebuild it with stronger materials. Then Lola had unfastened the thin gold bracelet from her own wrist, the one she had worn every day since Genevieve could remember, and fastened it around her granddaughter's wrist with careful fingers that had lost their steadiness but not their purpose. When the world tries to tell you who you are, you look at this and remember who told you first. A second, smaller envelope followed. That one's for decent shoes. You can't walk into a boardroom wearing those things you've been wearing. I've seen better footwear on scarecrows. Genevieve had laughed then, the kind of laugh that comes from being loved by someone who sees exactly who you are and is not interested in pretending otherwise. She carried that laugh into every room she entered for the next 21 years, along with the bracelet and the words and the understanding that the most valuable inheritances are not the ones counted in dollars. What Lola had not mentioned that afternoon, what Genevieve would not discover until 19 years later while sorting through boxes after the funeral, was that Lola had made another investment in 1983. A small parcel of Gulf Coast land purchased for $1,200 from a seller who needed cash fast and did not ask questions about why an elderly waitress wanted dirt nobody else wanted. Lola could not read geological surveys. She had left school at 14 to work and never went back. But she could read compasses, the old kind with needles that swung north regardless of what direction the holder wanted to travel. And her compass had pointed to that patch of Gulf Coast earth with an insistence she decided to trust. In 2003, when Genevieve turned 12, Lola had quietly amended the property trust to add her granddaughter's name. No fanfare, no explanation. No, just legal paperwork filed with a lawyer who charged $200 and asked no questions beyond the ones required to complete the forms correctly. The deed sat in a safety deposit box for 27 years, accumulating dust and property taxes Lola paid from an account Genevieve never knew existed, waiting for the moment when a quiet investment made by a woman who trusted her compass more than her education would prove to be the most important strategic decision anyone in the Whitmore family had ever made. But in 2009, sitting at that kitchen table with cancer, stealing her grandmother one cell at a time, Genevieve knew none of this. She knew only that she had $28,000, a gold bracelet, instructions to buy something nobody could take, and a future that felt vast and possible in the way futures feel vast and possible when you are 18 and your grandmother believes in you with the kind of belief that does not require evidence to sustain itself. She used the money to enroll at the University of Georgia, petroleum engineering, a choice that surprised everyone who thought waitresses' granddaughters should choose safer, more predictable paths. But Genevieve had read an article about Gulf oil leases in a magazine left behind at the diner where Lola worked, and something in her brain had clicked into place like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting for exactly that key. She worked full-time throughout college. Mornings at the campus bookstore, evenings at a gas station off Highway 41 weekends, catering events hosted by people who would years later take her phone calls on the first ring without knowing they were talking to the woman who had once served them crab cakes at their daughter's wedding. Necessity is a teacher that does not give extensions, and Genevieve learned every lesson necessity had to teach. She graduated in 4 years, not because she was naturally gifted though she was, but because she could not afford a 5th year. Debt was a trap she had watched claim too many people who started with hope and ended with payments that never quite caught up to principal. After graduation, she took an entry-level position at a Houston energy consulting firm. 3 years of being the youngest person in every meeting, the least connected person at every industry mixer, and the most prepared person in every room. She read geological surveys like other people read novels, staying up until midnight with highlighters and coffee, looking for patterns that other analysts were too busy or too comfortable to notice. It was at an industry mixer in her second year 2011 that she met Lawrence Kingsley, 52. Then semi-retired, a petroleum attorney with 40 years of experience and a reputation for being the quietest and most dangerous man in any negotiation room he entered. He noticed Genevieve because she was the only person at the event who had actually read the Henderson geological report that everyone else was pretending to understand while holding wine that cost more than her monthly rent. He walked over, introduced himself, and asked a question that would become the foundation of the most important professional relationship of Genevieve's life. "You actually read the Henderson report, didn't you?" She looked up, met his eyes without flinching, and delivered her analysis in 3 sentences that demonstrated she had not just read the report, but had identified the fatal flaw in its production estimates that would cost the company millions within 18 months. Lawrence stared at her for a long moment, then sat down beside her, and that conversation lasted until the event staff began stacking chairs around them. He became her mentor, not the kind who makes speeches and gives vague encouragement, but the kind who picks up the phone at 7 in the morning and says he will be there by Thursday and then shows up on Wednesday because the situation requires it. By 2019, Genevieve had built a network of contacts in Gulf Energy that would later become the foundation of everything. She knew the geologists, she knew the attorneys, she knew the landmen and the roughnecks and the pipeline engineers. She knew who was honest and who was not, and more importantly, she knew which category was more useful in which situation. Then she met Thaddeus Sterling at an industry conference in Houston, and for a while everything she had built became someone else's story. Thad was 39, handsome in the way that expensive suits make average men handsome, broad-shouldered, with a confident smile, and the particular gift of making eye contact 1 second too long, making people think it meant something profound, when really it was just a technique he had practiced in mirrors until it became automatic. He told her on the second night, sitting at the hotel bar with sleeves rolled and tie loosened in a way meant to look casual, but was actually calculated, that she was the smartest woman he had ever met, and that it intimidated him. Here is something worth knowing, something Genevieve learned too late, but you can learn right now when a man tells you your intelligence intimidates him. Pay very close attention to what he does next, because what he is actually telling you is that he has already figured out how to use it. They married after 8 months. Small ceremony. Genevieve wanted simple. Cordelia wanted it not to happen at all. But when it became clear that Thaddeus was proceeding with or without maternal blessing, Cordelia attended in a cream-colored suit and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and she began planning something that would take 3 years to complete. The early years were genuinely good, and that matters because what came later does not erase what came before. They built Sterling Energy together from Thad's garage in Atlanta, literally a garage with a folding table, 2 laptops, a coffee maker that only worked when struck at precisely the right angle, and more ambition than the space could hold. Genevieve brought everything that mattered: the clients, the technical knowledge, the credibility, the contacts. She had spent a decade building 1 handshake and 1 late night and 1 perfectly prepared report at a time. Her name opened doors that Thad's charm alone never could have. Thad brought the handshake, the smile, the ability to walk into a room and make every person in it feel like they were his closest friend and most important priority. He was good at that, genuinely good. It was the one skill he possessed that was entirely his own. She was the architect. He was the front door. For a while the arrangement worked. Late nights at the kitchen table, papers spread everywhere, coffee going cold, and neither of them noticing, planning the next pitch, reviewing contracts, building something together the way she had once built something alone at Lola's kitchen table. It felt like partnership. It felt like proof that love and ambition could live in the same house without one of them having to leave. But here is the thing about arrangements where one person is the foundation and the other person is the face. The face gets the credit. The face gets the handshakes and the magazine profiles and the invitations to events where important people gather to congratulate each other. And slowly, gradually, the way fog moves in before you realize you cannot see anymore, the foundation gets forgotten. Year 3. Thad stopped inviting Genevieve to client dinners. Said it was just easier if he went alone. Said clients preferred a more relaxed atmosphere. Said she could use the evening to rest. She noticed, but she said nothing because she was building something and she did not want to be the kind of wife who counted invitations. Year 5. The company website was redesigned. Genevieve's name disappeared from the About page. Thad said it was a formatting issue. The web designer made a mistake. It would be fixed next week. Next week became next month, became never. Year 7. Cordelia started attending family holidays with a new kind of energy, a purpose that Genevieve could feel but could not quite name yet. Comments delivered with smiles that made them almost impossible to challenge without sounding paranoid. "Genevieve, honey, isn't it time you focused on the home? Thaddeus is doing so well now. He really doesn't need you hovering around the office. A man needs room to grow." Year 8. Genevieve sat down one evening and looked at the company she had helped build from a garage. Every client relationship she had originated, every deal structure she had designed, every contact she had shared freely because she believed partnership meant sharing everything without keeping score. And she realized something that hit her like cold water. Her name was on nothing. Not the articles of incorporation, not the partnership agreement, not the client contracts, not the bank accounts. She had built the entire thing, and legally she owned exactly none of it. She had broken Lola's one rule. She had built her empire on someone else's land. The realization came quietly, the way the most devastating truths often do. No dramatic music, no witnesses. Just Genevieve alone in her home office at 11 on a Tuesday night, scrolling through corporate filings and understanding with absolute clarity that she had given away everything that mattered and received nothing in return except the privilege of watching someone else claim credit for her work. She did not confront Thad immediately. That was not who she was. Instead, she opened a small notebook, the kind available at any drugstore for $2, and she began documenting dates, meetings, client relationships and their origins, who had introduced whom, whose technical analysis had closed which deal. She wrote it all down with the methodical precision of someone who understood that feelings alone are not evidence, and evidence is what you need when the world is structured to believe the man in the expensive suit over the woman who helped him buy it. Then in November 2029, Genevieve drove home from a meeting in downtown Atlanta, turned into her own driveway, walked through her own front door, and entered her own kitchen to find Sloane Cartwright sitting at her table. Not standing in the doorway, not waiting in the living room. At the table, in Genevieve's chair, drinking from a mug that Genevieve's own hands had purchased at the Atlanta Christmas market in 2021, a ceramic piece with hand-painted magnolias that she had bought because it reminded her of Georgia Springs when the world turned soft and white. Cordelia sat across from Sloane, chatting in the relaxed, comfortable tone of a woman who felt entirely at home in someone else's house, as if this arrangement had already been decided, and Genevieve simply had not received the paperwork yet. Thad walked in from the hallway a minute later. He looked at his wife standing in the doorway of her own kitchen. He looked at the woman sitting at her table. And he said, without apology, without shame, without any recognition of what this moment actually was, that he had been meaning to talk to her, that it was time they had an honest conversation about their future. An honest conversation, as if anything about this scene involved honesty. Genevieve looked at him, looked at Sloane, looked at Cordelia, who held her gaze without blinking with the serene confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. Then Genevieve turned and walked back out the front door. She got in her car, sat in the driveway, did not turn the engine on. The sun went down. The streetlights came on. The houses around her lit up one by one with the warm glow of families eating dinner and watching television and living ordinary lives that did not include sitting in a dark car, wondering how everything you built ended up belonging to someone else. She did not cry until the third hour, and she cried the way strong women cry alone, completely without witnesses, and with the understanding that by morning she would need to be finished with it. She cried for Thad, not the man sitting in that kitchen with another woman, but the man she had believed in at a conference in Houston when she was 28 years old and the world still felt wide open. She cried for the late nights and the shared coffee and the pitch meetings they had prepared for together and the version of herself that had genuinely believed building something together meant it belonged to both of them equally. She grieved all of it right there in that driveway. Every year, every contact she had shared freely, every piece of expertise she had poured into a company that carried his name on the door because she had decided that love meant giving without keeping score. And then she was done because Eloise Whitmore's granddaughters did not break in ways that could not be rebuilt. They broke. And then they got up, and when they got up different. The next morning at 7, Genevieve made one phone call. "Lawrence, I'm ready." Lawrence Kingsley picked up on the second ring. He did not say good morning. He did not ask how she was doing. He simply said in the calm and certain voice of a man who had been waiting for this exact call for years that he would be in Atlanta by Thursday. Lawrence arrived on Wednesday, not Thursday, because he understood something about timing that most people never learn when someone finally asks for help after years of handling everything alone. The situation is already critical, and 24 hours might be the difference between salvaging something and watching it burn to ash. He walked into the conference room of the Atlanta law firm he had retained on Genevieve's behalf, carrying a briefcase that had traveled through 40 years of petroleum negotiations and 2 divorces and more backroom deals than most people encounter in 3 lifetimes. At 72, Lawrence moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned to waste neither motion nor words, and he wasted neither now. The documents he spread across the polished oak table represented 2 years of preparation that Genevieve had not known was happening. Preparation that began the moment Lawrence watched Thaddeus Sterling accept a Community Leadership Award in 2027 and thank everyone except the woman whose technical expertise had landed the contracts that funded the charity donation that earned him the award in the first place. Lawrence had been in the audience that night. He had watched Genevieve's face maintain perfect composure while her husband erased her from the narrative of her own achievement. And Lawrence had gone home and made phone calls. The investigation had been quiet, methodical, the kind of work that happens in margins and through trusted contacts who understand that some questions are better asked without official letterhead. What Lawrence discovered over those 2 years was not surprising to anyone who had spent time watching Thaddeus Sterling operate, but the documentation was thorough enough to withstand scrutiny in federal court, and that made all the difference between suspicion and prosecution. Sterling Energy had been bleeding money through fake consulting contracts since 2026. Shell companies registered in Delaware with names designed to sound legitimate: Meridian Strategic Solutions, Apex Energy Advisors Coastal Development Group. Each company traced back to a series of business entities ultimately controlled by Sloan Cartwright, whose previous employment history included 2 years at an investment firm that had quietly settled fraud allegations in 2024, and a brief stint at a consulting company that folded 6 months after she left, taking several clients' advance payments with it into dissolution. The contracts themselves were masterworks of plausible deniability. Consulting fees for strategic planning that produced no deliverable reports. Advisory services for projects that existed only as line items in budget documents. Retainer agreements for expertise that was never actually deployed. Each invoice carefully structured to stay just below the threshold that would trigger automatic financial review, each payment approved by Thaddeus Sterling, with electronic signatures that created permanent digital records. $4.2 million over 3 years siphoned from a company built on Genevieve's contacts and expertise, funded partially by the $50,000 from Lola's legacy that Genevieve had contributed in the first year when Sterling Energy needed bridge financing and banks were not yet convinced that a garage operation deserved their confidence. Lawrence laid out the evidence in neat stacks organized by fiscal year, each stack accompanied by analysis from forensic accountants who had charged premium rates for discretion and delivered documentation that would survive expert challenge. Wire transfer records, email exchanges discussing payment schedules, bank statements showing deposits into Sloan's shell companies within hours of Sterling Energy's payments clearing, tax returns that failed to properly disclose the arrangement, turning what might have been aggressive accounting into something that attracted federal attention of the kind that arrives with badges and warrants. But Lawrence had not come to Atlanta just to show Genevieve proof of crimes she had already suspected. He came because during those same 2 years of investigation, he had also been building something else entirely, something that would make the embezzlement evidence look like a footnote in a much larger story. In January 2028, while Genevieve was boxing up Lola's belongings in the house where she had grown up, Lawrence was in Houston meeting with geological survey firms. In March 2028, while Thaddeus was taking Sloan to Hilton Head for what he told the office was a client development retreat, Lawrence was reviewing mineral rights documentation for Gulf Coast properties purchased between 1980 and 1990. In July 2028, while Cordelia Sterling was hosting her annual charity gala and seating Genevieve at a side table near the kitchen entrance, Lawrence was negotiating with 3 different oil extraction companies about hypothetical partnership structures for hypothetical reserves on hypothetical properties. There was nothing hypothetical about the property. Genevieve discovered it in October 2028, 3 weeks after the kitchen table incident, while sorting through the last boxes from Lola's house. Most of the contents were exactly what you would expect from a woman who had lived in the same house for 50 years. Photo albums, kitchen items, clothes that smelled like the lavender sachets Lola tucked into every drawer. But in a box marked "Important Papers," buried beneath tax returns from the 1990s and warranty documents for appliances long since replaced, Genevieve found a folder containing a geological survey from 1983. The survey was crude by modern standards, conducted by a firm that had gone out of business in 1997, printed on paper that had yellowed at the edges and showed water damage along one corner. But the data was readable, and the property description matched a deed tucked into the same folder: 12 acres of Gulf Coast land in Alabama, purchased by Eloise Whitmore on March 15, 1983, for $1,200 cash. Genevieve had stared at the documents for 20 minutes, cross-referencing the legal description with county records she pulled up on her laptop, confirming what seemed impossible. Her grandmother, who had never owned more than the modest house she lived in, and a 13-year-old Ford Taurus, had purchased Gulf Coast property 45 years ago and never mentioned it to anyone in the family. The survey suggested oil reserves, but the estimates were vague based on limited core samples and geological modeling that predated modern seismic technology. Still, something had prompted Lola to commission a survey, and something had convinced her to hold on to land that generated only property tax bills and no income for nearly 40 years. Genevieve called Lawrence that night. She read him the property description, the survey findings, the purchase details. Lawrence was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that happens when someone is recalculating multiple scenarios simultaneously and arriving at conclusions they had not anticipated. "Don't tell Thaddeus. Don't tell anyone. I need 3 weeks." Lawrence used those 3 weeks to accomplish what most people could not accomplish in 3 years. He located the original survey firm's files in a bankruptcy archive in Mississippi. He commissioned a new geological survey from a company with technology that could penetrate Earth. Lola's 1983 team could barely scratch. He traced the property title back through 4 ownership transfers to confirm the chain was clean. He reviewed Alabama property law regarding marital assets and separate property to understand exactly how the timing of Lola's purchase related to Genevieve's marriage. And he discovered something that would change everything. The property was not 12 acres. It was 47 acres, a surveying error in the original deed that had never been corrected because nobody had cared enough about worthless Gulf Coast scrubland to pay for proper boundary documentation. The mineral rights were intact, never severed from the surface rights, a rarity in Gulf states, where most land had been picked over by oil companies in the boom decades. And the oil reserves were not modest. According to seismic data and core samples analyzed by 3 independent geology firms, the property sat above a formation that connected to a much larger reserve system, a network of oil-bearing rock that extended beneath the Gulf of Mexico and held an estimated $16.2 billion worth of recoverable crude at current market prices. $16 billion. $16 billion that belonged to a trust established in 2003, a trust whose sole beneficiary was Genevieve Eloise Whitmore, age 12 at the time of the trust's creation, age 39, now and legally entitled to every drop of oil beneath every acre of land her grandmother had purchased, with money saved from tips that most people would consider insulting. Lawrence confirmed the ownership structure through 6 different legal reviews. The property had never been marital property because Lola had purchased it in 1983, 16 years before Genevieve married Thaddeus. The trust amendment adding Genevieve's name had been executed in 2003, again long before the marriage. Alabama law was clear. Separate property acquired before marriage or by inheritance remained separate property even in divorce provided it had not been commingled with marital assets. The land had not been commingled. Genevieve had not known it existed until October 2028. Thaddeus had never contributed to its purchase, maintenance, or development. His name appeared nowhere in the title history. He had no legal claim, no equitable claim, no claim of any kind, except the claim of a man who believed that marriage meant ownership of everything a woman brought to the relationship along with everything she might inherit during it. Lawrence began building the acquisition structure in November 2028. Not a sale because selling would trigger capital gains taxes that would consume a significant percentage of the value, and because Genevieve had no interest in selling land, her grandmother had trusted her to steward. Instead, a joint venture partnership where Genevieve retained majority ownership and operational control while bringing in capital partners to fund extraction, refining, and distribution. The challenge was finding partners sophisticated enough to understand the opportunity and discreet enough to keep quiet while the legal structure was perfected. Lawrence started with people he had worked with for decades, petroleum executives who understood that the best deals happen before anyone else knows the asset is available. He made calls from his home office in Houston, never from any location that could be traced back to Genevieve, never mentioning her name until he was certain the listener could be trusted with information that would eventually reshape Gulf Coast energy markets. Declan Ashworth took the meeting in December 2028. 70 years old and wealthy, in the way that happens when someone makes correct decisions about oil reserves for 40 consecutive years. He had built Ashworth Energy from a 2-person operation in 1988 to a consortium that controlled extraction rights across 3 states, and he had done it by being smarter about geology than people who had more money and better connections, but less patience for reading seismic data. Lawrence showed him the surveys. Declan studied them for 3 hours without speaking, cross-referencing formation data with regional geology reports, checking boundary descriptions against his own maps of Gulf Coast reserves. When he finally looked up, his expression carried the particular intensity of someone who has just recognized something valuable that everyone else has overlooked. Who owns this client? I'm not at liberty to disclose identity yet. Does this client understand what they have? The client is a petroleum engineer with 15 years of experience in Gulf exploration. Yes, she understands exactly what she has. Declan's eyes narrowed slightly. Not many women in our field who could read these surveys at this level. Fewer than there should be, which is one of several problems my client intends to help solve once this asset is properly developed. What's she looking for? Full sale, partnership, extraction rights lease, majority ownership retained, joint venture with capital partners for development. She controls operations. Partners receive proportional return on investment with preferred return structure. Standard industry terms otherwise. Declan was quiet again, but this time the silence carried calculation rather than analysis. He was running numbers, projecting returns, estimating timelines from survey to first production to break-even to profit. Lawrence watched him work through it and knew the moment Declan reached the conclusion that this was the kind of opportunity that appears perhaps twice in a career if you are lucky and never at all if you are not. I want in. Whatever structure you're building, Ashworth Energy wants in. You'll need to meet her first. She's particular about partners. Anyone who understands this data well enough to know what they have would be particular about partners. When can I meet her? January. I need to finalize some other legal matters first. The legal matters Lawrence needed to finalize involved divorce proceedings that Thaddeus filed on February 3rd, 3 days after Genevieve discovered that Sterling Energy's board had voted to remove her from the company she had built. Thaddeus claimed irreconcilable differences and filed an emergency motion to freeze Genevieve's personal bank accounts pending investigation of allegedly hidden marital assets. The motion specifically mentioned the Gulf Coast property, which meant someone had been monitoring Genevieve's activities closely enough to discover the new geological survey, despite Lawrence's careful discretion. The most likely source was Cordelia, who had enough connections in Alabama legal circles to have placed alerts on property filings for anyone named Whitmore. The emergency freeze was granted on February 5th by a judge who appeared to have accepted Thaddeus's argument without requiring substantive evidence beyond the existence of the property and the timing of its discovery relative to divorce proceedings. Genevieve's checking account held $4,000. Her savings held $18,000, both frozen within 48 hours of the motion being granted. She could not access funds to pay rent, utilities, or legal fees for the divorce defense she would need to mount. The strategic purpose was obvious: force Genevieve into a desperate financial position that would compel her to accept an unfavorable settlement just to survive. What Thaddeus did not know was that Genevieve had learned from Lola to keep cash reserves in places that did not depend on anyone else's permission to access. $800 in 20s and 50s tucked into a book on her shelf. Not enough to live on for long, but enough to buy time. And time was what she needed because Lawrence was not finished building what they were building. The meeting with Declan happened on January 15th in Houston in Lawrence's office, rather than any public space where someone might recognize Genevieve and connect her presence to the Sterling divorce that was beginning to generate attention in Atlanta business circles. Declan arrived 30 minutes early, which told Lawrence everything he needed to know about how seriously Ashworth Energy was taking the opportunity. Genevieve walked in at exactly 2 o'clock, wearing a gray suit Lola had helped her buy for her first job interview in 2013. Clothes that had seen better days but still carried themselves with the dignity of garments that had witnessed important moments. She carried a leather portfolio containing geological surveys, formation analysis, extraction, feasibility studies, and financial projections she had prepared herself using the same methodical precision she had once applied to reports for Sterling Energy clients. She did not offer her hand. She set the portfolio on the conference table, opened it, and began presenting data. For 3 hours, Declan asked questions. Technical questions about formation depth and porosity and permeability. Financial questions about extraction costs and refining logistics and transportation infrastructure. Legal questions about mineral rights and regulatory permits and environmental compliance. Genevieve answered every question without hesitation, without notes, with the command of someone who had not just read the reports, but had verified every assumption and challenged every conclusion until she was certain the data would withstand expert scrutiny. At 5 o'clock, Declan leaned back in his chair and studied Genevieve with the expression of someone who has just solved a puzzle that had been bothering him. "I knew your grandmother." Genevieve's hands stilled on the portfolio. "You knew Lola, 1985. I was 35 trying to build Ashworth Energy, looking for Gulf Coast properties that the majors had overlooked. I offered Eloise Whitmore $50,000 for 12 acres of scrubland she'd bought 2 years earlier. Told her it was probably worthless, but I was assembling a larger parcel and needed her plot to complete the boundary. What did she say? She said her compass told her to keep it. I thought she meant some kind of folk wisdom. She meant an actual compass, the kind with a needle. Said she'd bought the land because her compass pointed there and she trusted north more than she trusted oil companies." Genevieve felt something shift in her chest, a realignment of understanding that changed the shape of everything she thought she knew about Lola's purchase. It had not been random. It had not been foolish. It had been faith in instruments that pointed toward truth regardless of what direction the holder wanted to travel. I tried to explain that compasses don't find oil. She told me that compasses find north, and north is where you go when you don't know where else to go. Then she sent me home. Declan's smile was the first genuine expression Genevieve had seen from him. Your grandmother was the smartest person in that conversation, and I was too young to realize it. She left the land to me, added my name to the trust when I was 12. She knew what she had. Maybe not the dollar figure, but she knew it mattered. And she trusted you to figure out the rest when the time came. Declan closed the portfolio. Ashworth Energy wants to partner on this. Majority ownership stays with you. We fund development standard joint venture terms. But I have one condition. Genevieve waited. I want your word that you'll name this project something that honors Eloise. She turned down $50,000 because her compass pointed north. That kind of conviction deserves recognition. Genevieve felt the bracelet shift against her wrist, Lola's gold warm against her skin. The Meridian Golf Project. Declan extended his hand. The Meridian Golf Project. We have a deal, Ms. Whitmore. They shook, and in that moment the structure Lawrence had been building for 2 years locked into place. Financing secured. Partnership terms negotiated. Development timeline established. The only remaining task was signing the formal agreements, and Lawrence had already scheduled that for February 27th at 4:47 in the afternoon, a time chosen because it would give Genevieve enough time to reach the Sterling celebration by 8 and deliver the news in the setting where it would have maximum impact. But first, 3 more catastrophes had to unfold, each designed by Cordelia Sterling, with the precision of someone who had spent 3 years planning exactly how to remove Genevieve from her son's life completely. The first catastrophe arrived on January 28th, when Sloan Cartwright appeared at a preliminary negotiation meeting between Lawrence and Gulf Atlantic Energy, a smaller firm that had expressed interest in partnering on the Meridian Gulf development before Declan's offer came through. Lawrence had not canceled the meeting because canceling would signal that better options had emerged, and signaling creates information that can be weaponized. Sloan walked into the conference room carrying a folder with the confidence of someone who believed they held decisive cards. She introduced herself as representing Sterling Energy's interests in properties related to Genevieve Whitmore. Properties that Sterling Energy claimed had been developed using company resources and company expertise during the marriage. Lawrence let her speak without interruption, watching the Gulf Atlantic representatives shift uncomfortably as Sloan presented what she characterized as competing claims to the mineral rights. The claims were built on notes Genevieve had made years earlier about potential Gulf Coast investment opportunities, notes stored on a shared drive during the years when she still trusted that shared digital spaces with her husband were safe places to work. The notes mentioned Gulf Coast properties generically, but did not reference Lola's specific parcel. Still, Sloan argued they demonstrated that Genevieve had used Sterling Energy infrastructure to research the opportunity, which created a corporate interest that predated any personal claim. The argument had no legal merit. Lawrence knew it. Gulf Atlantic's counsel knew it. But the argument created doubt, and doubt in business is almost as effective as proof. If there was any chance that signing a deal with Genevieve would expose Gulf Atlantic to litigation from Sterling Energy, the safer choice was to wait until the dispute resolved rather than risk becoming collateral damage in someone else's divorce. Gulf Atlantic's CEO delivered the news with apologetic language that disguised calculation. We need to pause discussions pending clarification of the ownership situation. I'm sure you understand. Lawrence understood perfectly. He also understood that Sloan's appearance had been timed to maximize disruption, arriving just as preliminary financing was being negotiated, creating uncertainty that could freeze capital and delay development long enough for Sterling Energy to mount more aggressive challenges through courts that might be sympathetic to arguments about marital property, regardless of legal merit. But Lawrence had already secured Declan's commitment, which meant Sloan's maneuver accomplished nothing except confirming what Lawrence had suspected. Cordelia Sterling was monitoring Genevieve's activities and coordinating with Sloan to deploy strategic interference at critical moments. The second catastrophe was the account freeze which Lawrence had anticipated and which actually worked in Genevieve's favor by demonstrating Thaddeus's willingness to use financial pressure as a weapon. Lawrence filed an emergency motion to unfreeze the accounts on February 8th, arguing that the property had never been marital property and that freezing accounts based on speculation about hidden assets violated Genevieve's due process rights. The hearing happened on February 10th. Lawrence presented the deed showing Lola's 1983 purchase, the trust amendment from 2003 documentation that the property had generated no income during the marriage and had required Genevieve to pay property taxes from separate funds. Thaddeus's attorney argued that the timing of the geological survey in 2028 suggested Genevieve had been planning to hide assets in anticipation of divorce. The judge reviewed the documents and asked one question that ended the hearing. Was the property purchased before or after the marriage? Before, 16 years before, and the trust naming Ms. Whitmore as beneficiary executed in 2003, 16 years before the marriage. Then it's separate property and the freeze is lifted. Next case. Genevieve's accounts were unfrozen that afternoon. She could pay rent, could pay. Lawrence's retainer could survive without, depending on the goodwill of people who had demonstrated they had none to offer. But the account freeze had accomplished Cordelia's secondary objective. It signaled to Genevieve that Sterling Energy was willing to deploy every available weapon, legal and otherwise, to prevent her from accessing resources that might give her independence. The third catastrophe was the board vote, which happened on February 10th, the same day the account freeze was lifted. Genevieve received notice via certified letter delivered to the small apartment she had rented after leaving the house she had shared with Thaddeus. The letter informed her that the Sterling Energy Board of Directors had voted unanimously to remove her from her position as Chief Technical Officer effective immediately. The board consisted of 5 members, Thaddeus Cordelia Sloan, and 2 outside investors who Cordelia had cultivated over the previous year with hospitality and access, and the implicit promise that aligning with Cordelia's interests would create opportunities that resisting would foreclose. The vote was 5-0. Genevieve had not been invited to defend herself, had not been given opportunity to present her contributions, had been simply erased from the organizational chart of a company that would not exist without the clients she had brought and the expertise she had deployed. The letter was signed by all 5 board members. But the final signature, the one that Genevieve stared at longest, belonged to Sloan Cartwright, who had been appointed Vice President of Strategic Development, a title that Genevieve had held until the day she discovered Sloan sitting at her kitchen table drinking from her mug. That night, February 10th at 2 in the morning, Genevieve sat on the floor of her apartment with her back against a wall and Lola's bracelet turning slow circles around her wrist. The apartment was small, a studio on Atlanta's east side with thin walls and a kitchen that smelled like the previous tenant's cooking, no matter how many times Genevieve cleaned. She had moved here in December after it became clear that staying in the house with Thaddeus was no longer safe, not physically, but psychologically, staying in a space where every room reminded her of what she had built and then watched be taken. On the floor beside her was the box from Lola's house, the one that had contained the geological survey and the deed and the trust papers. At the bottom of the box, beneath documents that had changed her life, was an envelope she had not opened yet, one marked in Lola's handwriting, "Open when they take everything." Genevieve had been carrying that envelope for 4 months, moving it from box to nightstand to bag and back again, not ready to open it because opening it meant acknowledging that everything had been taken, and acknowledging that meant accepting a defeat she had not been ready to accept. But tonight, sitting on a floor in an apartment she could barely afford, removed from a company she had built, divorced from a man she had loved, she understood that Lola had anticipated exactly this moment. The envelope contained a single page, Lola's handwriting, shaky but readable, dated April 2009, written in the weeks before cancer took what months of treatment could not save. My Evie, if you're reading this, someone took what you built. Good. Now you know what you're made of. I bought that Gulf land in 1983 because my compass pointed there. I can't read maps, never could, but I trust what pulls north. You're my north, baby girl. That deed has your name since you were 12. Nobody can take what's legally yours, Not with love, not with marriage, not with lawyers. Build it back. Build it bigger. Then show them who Whitmore women are. All my love, Lola. Tucked into the envelope behind the letter was the original deed from 1983 yellowed paper with Lola's signature in blue ink that had faded but not disappeared. And clipped to the deed was the trust amendment from 2003, the one that added Genevieve's name when she was 12 years old, before she knew what oil reserves were, before she understood that property could be power, before she learned that the most important inheritances are not the ones you expect. Genevieve read the letter 3 times. Then she touched the bracelet and felt something shift, a realignment of purpose that turned grief into fuel. Lola had known this would happen. Maybe not the specific details, but the general shape of it, that Genevieve would build something, that someone would take it, that Genevieve would need to remember what Whitmore women were made of when everything seemed lost. She picked up her phone and called Lawrence at 3 in the morning. He answered on the second ring because Lawrence was the kind of person who slept with his phone on and his mind prepared for emergencies. "I'm ready to weaponize the deal." Lawrence's response carried no surprise, only confirmation that he had been waiting for this call since February 10th. "We sign on the 27th. Declan's already cleared his schedule. Thaddeus is having a celebration that night. 400 guests. His birthday. Cordelia's orchestrating it." "I know. I've seen the invitation. Tables 1 through 5 for VIPs, table 12 near the back for people they want to pretend they invited. I want to sign at 4:47 and be at the Obsidian Grand by 8. I want to walk into that ballroom with the contract in my purse and let him finish his speech before anyone knows what I've done." Lawrence was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone who has spent 2 years building toward a moment and finally sees it arriving. "Cordelia thinks she's won. Thaddeus thinks he's won. Sloane thinks she's won. Let them think it for 13 more days." Genevieve felt Lola's bracelet against her skin. Metal warmed by body heat and 60 years of being worn by 2 women who understood that north is north even when the whole room is facing south. 13 more days, then we show them what north looks like. February 27th arrived with the particular clarity that comes before storms. Sky scrubbed clean by overnight rain and air carrying the sharpness of late winter giving way to early spring. Genevieve woke at 5 in the apartment that had become home despite never feeling like one. Walls too thin to block sounds from neighbors who fought at midnight and made love at 3, kitchen too small to hold more than one person comfortably. But hers, in a way, nothing had been hers since she walked out of the house she had shared with Thaddeus. She made coffee in the machine she had bought at Target for $30 cheaper than the espresso maker she had left behind, but it extracted caffeine from grounds, and that was all that mattered this morning. The mug she used was plain white ceramic, no hand-painted magnolias, no memories attached to Christmas markets or better days. She had learned something about objects in the 4 months since November. Things you buy yourself after losing everything carry a different weight than things acquired during times when loss seemed impossible. Lawrence had scheduled the signing for 4:47, a time specific enough to seem arbitrary, but chosen with the precision he applied to everything. Early enough to reach the Obsidian Grand by 8. Late enough that reversing course would be impossible once papers were signed. The timing created a window where Genevieve would exist in 2 states, simultaneously legally the owner of a $16 billion asset and socially the dismissed wife sitting at table 12, the woman whose husband was introducing his mistress as the real lady of the house, while the actual lady held documents that made everyone's assumptions irrelevant. She dressed in the burgundy gown at 3, 2 hours before the signing because the apartment had no full-length mirror and she needed to see herself completely before walking into rooms where being seen completely was the entire purpose. The gown was 6 years old, purchased for an anniversary, when anniversaries still felt like celebrations rather than calendar marks counting down to endings. The fabric had held its shape through dry cleaning and time burgundy deep enough to read as power without announcing it, cut simply enough to let the woman wearing it be the statement rather than the dress. Lola's bracelet fastened around her left wrist with the ease of ritual metal warm from living in the jewelry box beside her bed. thin gold that cost nothing by modern standards but carried more value than anything Cordelia Sterling wore to functions where value was supposed to be visible. Genevieve touched it once the way she always did, acknowledgement of the woman who had worn it first, and the compass that had pointed north when everyone else was facing directions that led nowhere useful. No other jewelry, no earrings, no necklace, no rings. Wedding bands sold to a pawn shop in January for $800 that covered rent, when the account freeze made covering rent impossible through conventional means. The absence of adornment was strategic. Tonight was not about decoration. It was about revelation. Lawrence's office occupied the 14th floor of a building in downtown Atlanta that had been new in the 1980s and had aged into the solid respectability that comes with decades of housing profitable law practices. The conference room faced west windows, framing a view of the city Genevieve had called home for 11 years, towers of glass and steel reflecting afternoon light that would become sunset in another 2 hours. Declan Ashworth arrived at 4:30 earlier than required, because people who take $16 billion opportunities seriously arrive early to everything. He wore a dark suit that had been tailored in Houston by someone who understood that men of a certain age and accomplishment require clothes that convey authority without trying to reclaim youth. At 70, Declan had stopped pretending that being older was anything other than advantage. Decades of decisions informing current judgment in ways that youth could not replicate regardless of energy or ambition. Behind him came 3 people whose presence transformed the signing from simple contract execution into the kind of moment that changes markets. Sarah Chen, Chief Financial Officer of Ashworth Energy 45, and sharp in the way that women get sharp when they have spent careers proving themselves in rooms designed to exclude them. Marcus Webb, Lead Petroleum Engineer 58 with 30 years of Gulf Coast experience and the particular confidence that comes from having drilled in formations that lesser engineers said were impossible. And Catherine Morrison, General Counsel 62 and responsible for reviewing every word of every document that would be signed in the next 17 minutes. They spread documents across the conference table with the choreography of people who had performed this ritual enough times to know exactly how it should look. Partnership agreement, operating agreement, capital contribution schedules, development timeline, profit distribution matrices, environmental compliance protocols, regulatory filing procedures. Each document representing months of negotiation condensed into language precise enough to withstand legal challenge and flexible enough to accommodate the uncertainties inherent in extracting oil from formations that had been hidden beneath Gulf Coast earth for millions of years. Lawrence reviewed each document aloud, not because Genevieve needed the review, but because witnesses to contract signing serve a purpose beyond watching signatures happen. They confirm that parties understood terms, that nobody was coerced, that the agreement reflected informed consent rather than confusion or pressure. Catherine Morrison listened with the attention of someone whose job was finding problems before they became liabilities, and she found none because Lawrence had spent 2 years ensuring there were none to find. At 4:45, Lawrence placed the signature pages in front of Genevieve. 7 documents requiring signatures, each signature committing her to obligations and entitlements that would reshape her life and the Gulf Coast energy markets and the narrative everyone at the Obsidian Grand believed they were living inside tonight. Declan spoke before she signed, voice carrying the weight of someone delivering information that mattered. Your grandmother turned down my offer in 1985 because her compass pointed north. I thought she was foolish then. I was 35 and arrogant enough to believe that instruments mattered less than expertise. She taught me something that day that I've never forgotten. Sometimes the simplest tools point toward truth that sophisticated analysis misses. Genevieve's pen hovered above the first signature line. What made you believe her? Eventually, I didn't believe her. I believed the geology. But 30 years later, drilling formations nobody else thought were worth exploring, I started carrying a compass. Not because it finds oil, because it reminds me that north is north regardless of what direction I want to travel, and sometimes the most important thing is knowing which direction you're actually facing, instead of which direction you wish you were facing. Genevieve signed the first document, pen moving across paper with the firmness of someone who had stopped questioning whether this was the right decision and had moved into the clarity that comes after questioning ends. She signed the second document, then the third, working through the stack with mechanical precision that disguised the fact that her heart was beating hard enough to make the bracelet shift against her wrist with each pulse. The seventh signature, completed at 4:47 exactly, timestamp on the notary's seal, confirming the moment when Genevieve Eloise Whitmore became the majority owner of the Meridian Gulf project, controlling interest in an asset valued at $16.2 billion, sole authority over development decisions, entitled to 60% of profits after capital partners received their preferred returns. Declan extended his hand across the table. "Welcome to the partnership, Miss Whitmore. Ashworth Energy is honored to work with you." They shook, and the gesture carried more weight than ceremony usually allows, because both of them understood that this was not just a business transaction. It was validation of Lola's faith in compasses and north and trusting instruments that pointed toward truth, even when truth looked like 12 acres of worthless scrubland purchased for $1,200 by a woman who had never owned anything valuable in her life until she trusted her compass more than other people's expertise. Lawrence gathered the signed documents into his briefcase with movements that suggested relief despite his expression revealing nothing. The documents would be filed tomorrow morning with regulatory agencies and county clerks and industry databases that tracked ownership of Gulf Coast assets. By tomorrow afternoon, the signing would be public record. But tonight, for the next 4 hours, the information belonged only to the 7 people in this conference room, and that gave Genevieve the one thing she needed most: time to be underestimated one final time by people who had built their plans on the assumption that she was powerless. Sarah Chen broke the professional atmosphere with a question that shifted the energy in the room. "Do you need company tonight? I've heard about the Sterling celebration. Nobody should walk into that alone." Genevieve appreciated the offer enough to smile, the first genuine smile that had touched her face in hours. "I've been walking into rooms alone since I was 18. It's where I do my best work." The Obsidian Grand stood on Peachtree Street with the architectural confidence of a building designed to host events where appearance mattered more than substance, which made it perfect for tonight's purpose. Genevieve arrived at 7:55, deliberately late enough that most guests would already be seated, but early enough that Thaddeus's speech had not yet begun. The valet took her car keys with the professional courtesy that expensive venues train into their staff, the kind of courtesy that treats everyone the same until they determine who actually matters. The lobby carried the muted elegance of old Atlanta money, attempting to signal sophistication through restraint marble floors polished to mirror finish. Crystal chandeliers sized to impress, without overwhelming flower arrangements that cost more than most people's car payments, positioned at intervals designed to create beauty without obstructing sightlines. Guests moved through the space in clusters determined by social hierarchy, visible to anyone who understood the language, business leaders gravitating toward each other, political donors forming separate circles, younger attendees hovering at the edges, waiting for opportunities to migrate toward more influential groups. Genevieve crossed the lobby without stopping, gown moving around her legs in ways that drew attention from men who looked and then looked away quickly when they recognized her face, the awkward double-take of people who knew who she was, but were not certain whether acknowledging her presence would create social complications they preferred to avoid. She was the ex-wife, the woman being replaced tonight, the person whose presence at this event should have been impossible, except that someone had apparently invited her, or failed to ensure she was not invited, and either way, her attendance created uncertainty that made people uncomfortable. The ballroom doors stood open, staff positioned to check invitations, but not stopping anyone who moved with the confidence of belonging. Genevieve walked through without presenting credentials, because presenting credentials meant accepting that she needed permission to enter spaces, and accepting that meant giving power to gatekeepers whose only authority was the authority she granted by acknowledging they possessed it. Table 12 was exactly where she expected, back corner near the emergency exit, far enough from the main tables that conversation would be difficult, but close enough to be technically present. 3 other people already occupied seats, strangers to each other and to Genevieve. The kind of guests who get placed at peripheral tables because someone owed them an invitation, but not a good one. They glanced up when she sat, nodded polite acknowledgement, returned to studying their phones with the focused attention of people trying to look busy so nobody would try to start conversations they did not want to have. Genevieve set her purse beside her chair, burgundy leather that matched the gown interior containing the documents Lawrence had given her after the signing partnership agreement with her signature and Declan's operating agreement outlining ownership structure, one-page summary of terms suitable for projection on screens if projection became necessary. The purse was not expensive by Cordelia Sterling's standards, but it held more power than anything Cordelia had carried into this ballroom in her entire life. From table 12, Genevieve could see everything that mattered. Main tables at the front where Cordelia held court, surrounded by Atlanta's social elite, who understood that proximity to Cordelia Sterling meant access to networks that opened doors. Table 2, where Thaddeus sat beside Sloane, her gold dress catching light each time she moved, his hand resting on her shoulder with the casual ownership of someone who believed he had traded up and wanted everyone to notice. Table 5, where business partners who had once worked with Genevieve now worked exclusively with Sterling Energy. Their presence tonight, a statement about which side they had chosen when choosing sides became necessary. 400 people who believed they understood tonight's narrative. Successful businessman celebrates milestone. Birthday introduces new partner, moves forward from failed marriage with grace and confidence. The story was clean, simple, designed by Cordelia to position Thaddeus as protagonist in a tale where Genevieve existed only as prologue. The early chapter. You skim through to reach the parts where actual plot begins. What none of them knew was that the woman at table 12 had spent the afternoon signing documents that rewrote the story completely, documents that transformed her from dismissed wife into oil baroness, from peripheral character into the person whose decisions would determine whether Sterling Energy survived the next 6 months. At 8:45, Cordelia Sterling rose to deliver opening remarks. Microphone amplifying her voice to reach the back corners where people like Genevieve sat in spaces designed for people who did not matter. She spoke about vision and leadership and the importance of knowing when to release the past and embrace the future. Words chosen carefully to sound inspirational while containing enough subtext to ensure that anyone paying attention understood she was talking about her son's divorce as narrative of liberation rather than failure. The speech lasted 8 minutes. Applause followed, polite at first, then building as people closer to the main tables stood to demonstrate enthusiasm. Cordelia acknowledged the response with a smile that showed perfect teeth maintained through decades of excellent dental care and the genetic fortune of jaw structure that photographs well. Then Thaddeus took the podium, and the energy in the room shifted from polite attention to genuine interest, because everyone knew that birthday speeches at 40th celebrations were where announcements happened, where men at midlife pivots declared intentions about second acts and new directions. Thaddeus wore a navy suit that had been tailored specifically for tonight, fabric moving correctly when he gestured fit, communicating success without trying too hard to communicate it. He began with gratitude, thanking everyone for attending, acknowledging Cordelia's role in raising him to understand the importance of community and contribution. He mentioned Sterling Energy's growth revenue numbers that sounded impressive to people who did not understand that the revenue existed only because Genevieve had brought the clients who generated it. He discussed future plans, expansion into new markets, strategic partnerships being developed. All of it vague enough to sound ambitious without committing to specifics that could later be proven false. Then he shifted tone, voice, dropping into the register menus when they want to sound sincere, when they want to signal that what comes next is not business, but personal, not strategic, but emotional. I want to thank my true partner, the woman who stood by me when it mattered, who believed in this vision when others doubted. The applause started before he finished the sentence, people anticipating where this was heading and wanting to demonstrate that they supported it. Thaddeus pulled Sloane forward from her seat, her hand finding his with practiced ease, her smile calibrated to suggest humility, while her eyes scanned the room to confirm that people were watching. This is the real lady of this house. The words landed exactly as Cordelia had planned when she coached Thaddeus through this speech 3 times yesterday afternoon, each rehearsal tightening the delivery until it sounded spontaneous rather than scripted. This is the woman who understands what we're building, who shares the vision, who will stand beside me as we move Sterling Energy into its next chapter." Sloan took the microphone, voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Thank you, Thad. Thank you, Cordelia. Thank you to everyone here tonight who has supported us." Her eyes swept the ballroom, landing briefly on table 12, holding Genevieve's gaze for half a second before moving on. "And to anyone who thought they were irreplaceable tonight proves otherwise." The applause was louder now, some guests standing cameras from the live stream capturing the moment for the 2,000 online viewers who had contributed to campaigns and causes and wanted to see the story Cordelia had sold them. Strong man making strong choice, weak woman relegated to past where she belonged. Genevieve sat perfectly still. Her face showed nothing that would give anyone in this room the satisfaction of a reaction. Her hands rested in her lap. Left wrist turned slightly so Lola's bracelet caught light, thin gold that mattered more than every diamond Sloan wore combined. She did not applaud. She did not stand. She simply waited for the moment that was coming, the moment that would arrive when walking toward it rather than running from it, the moment when north would be north regardless of what direction 400 people thought they were facing. At 9:05, after speeches concluded and servers began circulating with champagne, Genevieve stood. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, designed to suggest she was leaving rather than repositioning. She picked up her purse, stepped away from table 12, and walked toward the restrooms near the emergency exit path, taking her along the back wall where lighting was dimmer and attention was elsewhere. She did not go to the restroom. She went to the service corridor beyond it, the space where staff moved between kitchen and ballroom without being seen by guests who preferred not to see the mechanics of hospitality. A staff member glanced at her, started to say something about restricted access, stopped when he saw her face, and decided that whatever was happening was not his problem to solve. The corridor connected to the main entrance lobby through a door marked for employee use only. Genevieve pushed through it and found herself back in the marble-floored space she had crossed 40 minutes earlier, now mostly empty except for late arrivals still checking coats and early departures who had decided the speeches were sufficient and dinner was optional. Standing near the elevators, exactly where Lawrence had told her he would be at 9:05, was Declan Ashworth. He wore the same dark suit from the signing, no attempt to blend into the celebration happening in the ballroom, because blending was not the purpose of his presence tonight. The purpose was visibility, the kind of visibility that happens when someone recognizable walks into a space where their appearance requires explanation. Ready. His voice carried the calm of someone who had spent 40 years walking into rooms where his presence changed calculations. Genevieve touched the bracelet, felt metal warm against skin, thought about Lola buying land because a compass pointed north, and trusting that north mattered even when she could not see what north contained. "I was ready the moment I signed this afternoon. Everything since then has been waiting for the room to catch up." They walked back through the service corridor together, Declan's presence transforming the walk from escape into entrance, from leaving into arriving. The staff member who had questioned Genevieve earlier said nothing when she returned with a man whose face he recognized from business sections and energy industry publications, someone whose presence meant this was not a person sneaking through restricted areas, but someone who moved through restricted areas because restrictions applied to other people. At 9:15 exactly, Genevieve pushed open the ballroom door and stepped through with Declan beside her. The room was mid-dinner service, servers moving between tables with entrees chosen months ago from options designed to offend nobody and delight nobody. Safe food for safe people having safe conversations about markets and politics, and children who attended the right schools. Declan did not walk toward table 12. He walked down the center aisle between tables, pace measured but purposeful trajectory, aimed toward the front of the room, but not toward the main tables where Cordelia and Thaddeus sat watching, with expressions that shifted from confusion to recognition to alarm as they understood who was walking toward them and what his presence might mean. He stopped at table 12, turned to face Genevieve, and spoke at a volume designed to carry beyond their immediate space, voice trained by decades of boardrooms and negotiation sessions, where being heard clearly mattered more than being loud. "Ms. Whitmore, congratulations on the Meridian Gulf closing. $16.2 billion is historic achievement, the largest private oil acquisition in 20 years. Ashworth Energy is honored to partner with you on this development. The silence started at the tables closest to them and spread outward through the ballroom like ripples moving across still water, conversations dropping mid-sentence as people processed what they had just heard and tried to reconcile it with everything they thought they understood about the woman at table 12. Genevieve accepted. Declan's hand shook it with the firmness of equals meeting in spaces where equality was assumed rather than negotiated, and then she turned to face the room. 400 people stared back, 400 faces showing variations of the same confusion. 400 minds trying to recalculate narratives that had seemed simple 5 seconds ago and now seemed incomplete in ways they could not quite identify yet. Thaddeus had gone pale, color draining from his face with the speed that happens when blood redirects from surface to core body responding to threat before mind has fully processed what the threat is. Sloane's hand had released his arm, gold dress suddenly looking like costume rather than statement, her confidence evaporating as she understood that something had changed, but not yet what that something was. Cordelia remained composed, decades of social training maintaining posture, even as her eyes narrowed and calculations began running behind them, searching for angles and responses and ways to regain control of a situation that was sliding toward chaos. Genevieve walked toward the podium, not running but not hesitating either pace, suggesting that taking the microphone was her right rather than her presumption. Thaddeus stepped back without conscious decision, body obeying instinct that said moving aside was safer than standing in the path of whatever was coming. She reached the podium at 9:17, hand closing around the microphone with the same firmness she had used to sign documents 3 hours earlier, and then she began speaking in a voice that carried none of the emotion 400 people expected to hear from a dismissed wife at her replacement's celebration. My grandmother told me something when I was 18. Buy something with your name on the deed, Evie, not your heart on someone's promise. Her words were even measured the tone of someone delivering information rather than indictment. I took my time, but I got it done. Today, 4:47 this afternoon, I signed as sole private owner of the Meridian Gulf oil field. $16.2 billion. She paused, let the number settle into the silence, watched faces begin to change as comprehension replaced confusion. The land my grandmother Eloise bought in 1983 for $1,200. Mrs. Sterling, you and Mr. Ashworth offered her $50,000 in 1985. She said no. Turns out her compass was right. $16 billion right. Genevieve nodded toward the back of the room where Lawrence stood beside a laptop connected to the ballroom's projection system. The screen behind her illuminated, displaying the first document partnership agreement with signatures visible her name in clear script beside Declan's dated February 27th, time-stamped 4:47. The deed has my name since I was 12 years old. Never marital property, never community assets. A trust. Untouchable. The second document appeared, 1983 deed showing Lola's purchase, 2003 trust amendment, adding Genevieve's name when she was 12 decades before marriage meant anything, and Thaddeus Sterling was still figuring out how to use his charm to disguise the absence of substance beneath it. Mr. Sterling, you asked me to explain our future tonight. Here it is. You have no claim to my land. You have no claim to my company. You have no claim to anything I built. The third document filled the screen geological survey results, reserve estimates, valuation data that confirmed everything she had said and removed any possibility that this was bluff or exaggeration or desperate attempt to claim relevance. But since we're having honest conversations, Genevieve's voice remained steady, each word deliberate. Lawrence, please show the final slide. The forensic audit appeared, numbers and wire transfers and shell company names displayed in fonts large enough to read from the back of the ballroom. $4.2 million in fraudulent transfers over 3 years, documented with bank statements and email exchanges and corporate filings that proved what suspicion had always suggested, that Sterling Energy had been funding Sloane's lifestyle through fake consulting contracts, while Genevieve's contacts generated the revenue that made the theft possible. The FBI is outside. Her final words carried the weight of conclusion rather than threat, statement of fact, rather than desire for drama. I believe they'd like a word with several people in this room." The doors at the back of the ballroom opened, and 4 federal agents entered, badges, visible expressions professionally neutral. They moved toward the main tables with the unhurried certainty of people executing warrants they had prepared in advance, warrants based on evidence Lawrence had delivered to prosecutors 3 days ago, along with testimony about financial crimes that carried penalties measured in years rather than months. Cordelia stood, tried to leave, found her path blocked by an agent whose presence communicated that leaving was not an option currently available. Thaddeus opened his mouth to speak, but no words emerged, voice failing when he needed it most. Sloan backed away from the table, eyes searching for exits and finding all of them blocked by guests who had formed an unconscious wall, nobody moving to help, because helping meant associating themselves with something that had transformed from celebration into crime scene. Declan Ashworth stood, voice carrying across the ballroom with the authority of someone whose word moved markets. Effective immediately, Ashworth Energy withdraws all investments from Sterling Energy. We don't do business with people who confuse theft with entrepreneurship. 3 other investors rose from their seats and followed Declan toward the exit. Their departure more devastating than arrests, because it signaled that Sterling Energy had just lost the capital that kept it operational, the money that paid salaries and leases and all the overhead required to maintain appearances of success. Genevieve walked toward the exit, stopped at table 12 long enough to collect her purse, then continued past Cordelia without speaking, because speaking would have suggested that Cordelia's opinion still mattered enough to deserve acknowledgement. The last words she spoke were aimed at the room rather than any individual delivery, as calm as everything that had preceded it. "The live stream to your donors is still running, Mrs. Sterling. I hope the footage serves whatever purpose you intended it to serve." Then she walked out through doors held open by guests who had pressed themselves against walls to create path. 400 people who had come to witness the dismissal of a woman they had underestimated, discovering that the woman they had underestimated owned more than all of them combined and had just used that ownership to demonstrate what happens when quiet people decide it is time to speak. The Atlanta night air hit her face as she stepped outside, February cold but not bitter, the kind of temperature that clears heads after spending hours in overheated ballrooms, breathing recycled air and other people's assumptions. Genevieve stood on the steps of the Obsidian Grand for a moment, letting the shock of the evening settle into her bones, transforming from adrenaline into something more permanent, something that would sustain her through what came next. Lawrence emerged from the building 30 seconds later, briefcase in hand, expression showing satisfaction despite his lawyer's habit of revealing nothing. That went exactly as planned. Better. They recorded their own destruction and broadcast it to 2,000 people. Cordelia built the gallows. They climbed the stairs themselves. Lawrence's car was waiting at the curb, black sedan that looked like every other lawyer's car in Atlanta, except that this one contained a box of documents Lawrence had been storing for exactly this moment. He opened the back door, retrieved a folder, handed it to Genevieve. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The first was a motion to dismiss the divorce proceedings based on fraud in the inducement, Thaddeus having filed for divorce while actively embezzling from the marital estate, which created grounds for voiding the entire proceeding. The second was a counterclaim for damages seeking repayment of the $50,000 Genevieve had contributed to Sterling Energy's founding, plus interest compounded over 11 years. The third was a restraining order preventing Thaddeus, Cordelia, or Sloan from contacting Genevieve for any purpose while criminal proceedings were pending. "I'll file these Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, the criminal charges will be public. By Tuesday, Sterling Energy will be in receivership, and you'll be the only person with clean hands in this entire mess." What happens to Thaddeus? Federal prosecutors are offering a plea deal. 4 years minimum security. If he cooperates fully, provides testimony against Cordelia and Sloan, and agrees to permanent forfeiture of any claims against you or your assets. If he refuses, they'll pursue maximum penalties. Wire fraud, tax evasion, embezzlement. He's looking at 15 years hard time. And Sloan. She fled, left the country. Tuesday afternoon, probably figured out the FBI was closing in. She's in the Cayman Islands now, beyond immediate extradition, but trapped there until she decides whether living in paradise with limited funds is better than facing prosecutors with overwhelming evidence. Lawrence allowed himself a thin smile. She'll run out of money in 6 months. The shell companies are frozen. Her legitimate accounts are frozen. She'll either come back and negotiate a plea or spend the rest of her life in increasingly cheaper accommodations on increasingly smaller islands. Cordelia lost everything that matters to her. Political career finished the moment those live stream recordings went public. Every board she sat on has requested her resignation. The charity organizations she chaired are distancing themselves. Her social circle has evaporated. She's facing financial ruin, criminal charges, and the particular hell of watching her son go to prison for crimes she orchestrated. Lawrence closed the folder. Sometimes the worst punishment is not prison. It's losing the power you spent your entire life accumulating and watching everyone who pretended to respect you reveal that they only respected the power. Genevieve looked back at the obsidian grand lights blazing in windows where 400 people were presumably still processing what they had witnessed, some already making calls to their own lawyers to ensure they had no legal exposure from their association with Sterling Energy, others recalculating their social allegiances, now that Cordelia Sterling had transformed from powerful matriarch into criminal defendant. What happens to Sterling Energy bankruptcy within weeks? The withdrawal of capital tonight guarantees it. Employees will lose jobs, which is unfortunate but unavoidable. Clients will migrate to competitors. The brand is toxic. Within a year, Sterling Energy will exist only as case study in business school classes about corporate fraud and the importance of proper governance. And the clients I brought. The relationships I built. Lawrence opened the car door wider, gestured for Genevieve to sit. We should discuss that somewhere more private than a curb outside a crime scene. They drove to Lawrence's office, same building where the signing had happened 6 hours earlier. Those 6 hours felt like 6 years, measured in how completely the world had rearranged itself around new facts. Lawrence made coffee in the small kitchen adjacent to the conference room, real coffee from beans. He ground himself the kind of attention to detail that characterized everything he did. The clients you brought to Sterling Energy are not legally bound to stay. Most of them worked with you personally, trusted your expertise, valued your analysis. They stayed with Sterling Energy after you left because they didn't know where you went and assumed continuity was safer than change. Lawrence set a mug in front of Genevieve, steam rising with the rich scent of Colombian dark roast. Tomorrow morning we send letters to each of those clients. We inform them that you are now affiliated with Whitmore Energy, that you are available to provide the same services they received from you at Sterling Energy, and that you would welcome the opportunity to continue the professional relationships that Sterling Energy's criminal activity has unfortunately disrupted. Whitmore Energy. It's been registered since January. Corporate structure, tax status, business licenses, everything ready to activate the moment you decide it's time. You own 100%. No partners, no investors, no board that can vote you out. Just you and whatever staff you choose to hire. Genevieve wrapped her hands around the mug, felt heat seep into palms that had been cold despite the temperature being moderate. I built Sterling Energy once. Building it again feels like admitting I wasted 11 years. You didn't build Sterling Energy. You built the expertise, the relationships, the reputation that Sterling Energy exploited. Those things are still yours. Thaddeus never owned them. He just borrowed them and pretended they were his. Lawrence sat across from her, decades of experience visible in the lines around his eyes. Now you build something that actually belongs to you. Whitmore Energy. With your name on every document, your vision guiding every decision, your values determining who you work with and how you work with them. How long will it take? 6 months to be operational at the level Sterling Energy achieved, 12 months to exceed it, 24 months to dominate the market segment they thought they owned. Lawrence's confidence was not bluster, but calculation based on knowing exactly what Genevieve was capable of when nobody was stealing her work and claiming it as their own. You have something Sterling Energy never had: integrity. Clients will pay premium rates for that once they understand that integrity is worth more than convenience. They sat in the conference room until 3 in the morning, building the structure that would become Whitmore Energy, identifying which clients to approach first, which employees from Sterling Energy might be willing to jump ship once they understood the full extent of what Thaddeus and Cordelia had done, which office space to lease and which technology to invest in, and which markets to target for expansion beyond the Gulf Coast petroleum consulting that had been Genevieve's specialty. By the time Genevieve left Lawrence's office, sunrise was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. February dawn turning Atlanta's glass towers into mirrors, reflecting pink and gold. She drove back to her apartment with the windows down despite the cold, needing the shock of fresh air to confirm that this was real, that the night had actually happened, that the documents in her purse were legal proof of transformation rather than fever dream conjured by desperation. The weeks that followed moved with the momentum of objects in motion encountering no resistance. Federal prosecutors held a press conference on March 2nd announcing charges against Thaddeus Sterling, Cordelia Sterling, and Sloan Cartwright for wire fraud, tax evasion, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. The defendants had documented their own crimes with emails and wire transfers and corporate filings designed to hide activity from regulators. But that ended up creating permanent records prosecutors could use to build cases, requiring no additional investigation. Thaddeus took the plea deal on March 15th. 4 years minimum security, full cooperation with prosecutors, permanent forfeiture of any claims against Genevieve or her assets. He would serve his time at a federal facility in Alabama that housed white-collar criminals who posed no threat to other inmates allowed to work in the prison library, eligible for early release after 30 months if he maintained good behavior and continued cooperation. Cordelia refused to negotiate. She maintained her innocence, despite the evidence, hired expensive attorneys who filed motions challenging everything from the validity of the warrants to the jurisdiction of the prosecutors to the admissibility of the forensic audit. The motions were denied systematically, and Cordelia was scheduled for trial in October. Legal experts predicted conviction on most counts and sentencing somewhere between 8 and 12 years, though her age and lack of prior criminal history might reduce actual time served. Sloan remained in the Cayman Islands, living in increasingly modest accommodations as her frozen accounts yielded no funds, and her attempts to access money through intermediaries triggered alerts that brought federal attention. Extradition proceedings were initiated in April but moved slowly through diplomatic channels. Prosecutors were in no hurry. Sloan was trapped on an island with limited resources and no long-term plan, which made her more likely to eventually negotiate a surrender than to successfully evade justice permanently. Sterling Energy filed for bankruptcy protection on March 23rd. The company owed $4.8 million to creditors, held assets worth approximately $1.2 million after accounting for depreciation and market conditions, and faced multiple lawsuits from former employees and clients who claimed they had been defrauded or misled. The bankruptcy trustee began liquidating assets in April, selling office furniture and computer equipment and the few contracts that still held value to competitors who purchased them at steep discounts. Genevieve watched it happen from a distance, receiving updates from Lawrence but not involving herself directly in Sterling Energy's dissolution, because involving herself meant caring about something she had already grieved and released. The company died exactly as it had lived, badly managed, poorly structured, built on foundations that collapsed the moment pressure was applied. Whitmore Energy launched officially on April 1st, a date Genevieve chose specifically because it signaled that starting over was not admission of failure, but embrace of opportunity. The company occupied office space in the same building that housed Lawrence's practice, convenient for collaboration and appropriate for a startup that did not need to project established success because its founder's reputation did that work already. The first client was a petroleum exploration company that had worked with Genevieve at Sterling Energy, valued her geological analysis, and had been searching for her since learning about the bankruptcy. The contract was modest, $30,000 for a 6-week engagement analyzing potential drilling sites in Louisiana formations, but it established precedent and created reference that other clients could verify. The second and third clients followed within 10 days, both of them former Sterling Energy accounts that had been in contact with Genevieve directly and wanted to continue those relationships regardless of what corporate entity employed her. By the end of April, Whitmore Energy had 7 active contracts worth a combined $400,000 in revenue, enough to cover expenses and hire 2 junior analysts to handle work that Genevieve could delegate while she focused on the complex geological analysis that only she could provide. By June, the company had 15 clients and 8 employees. By August, 23 clients and 12 employees' office space expanding to occupy the entire 14th floor, revenue projections for the first year approaching $2 million. The growth was not accidental, but inevitable, the natural result of expertise meeting opportunity without interference from people who stole credit and claimed value they had not created. 6 months after the night at the Obsidian Grand, Genevieve stood in her office overlooking Atlanta mid-August, heat making the air shimmer beyond windows that faced south toward the city center. The office was modest by executive standards, desk inherited from Lawrence's storage closet chair, purchased on sale from an office supply chain. No artwork beyond geological survey maps pinned to walls with pushpins. The space looked nothing like the executive suite Thaddeus had occupied at Sterling Energy, and that was precisely the point. This office existed for work rather than performance, function rather than display. On her desk beside the laptop that contained client files and geological data and financial projections sat 3 objects that mattered more than anything else in the room. Lola's gold bracelet, removed from her wrist for the first time in months, resting on a small velvet pad where it caught afternoon light. The compass Lola had used to select the Gulf Coast land brass, weathered by decades of use, but needles still swinging north with the reliability of physics that did not care about human intentions, and a letter handwritten on paper that had yellowed slightly with time. Lola's words from April 2009, reminding Genevieve that north was north even when everyone else was facing south. A knock interrupted her contemplation. Lawrence entered without waiting for invitation privilege, earned by 2 years of proving that he deserved access to spaces where Genevieve worked and thought and planned futures that depended on his counsel. "You asked me to bring these when they arrived." He set a folder on the desk manila envelope containing documents that had been delivered to his office that morning by courier from a law firm in Mobile, Alabama. Genevieve opened the envelope carefully, though she knew what was inside, because Lawrence had briefed her on its contents 2 weeks earlier when the Mobile firm first made contact. Inside were 3 documents, each one a property deed, each one identifying land purchased by Eloise Whitmore in years when such purchases made no sense unless the purchaser was following instruments that pointed north, regardless of what logic suggested. The first deed was dated November 1981, 2 years before the Gulf Coast purchase, 12 acres in northern Alabama near the Tennessee border, purchased for $800 from a seller who needed cash and did not care why an elderly waitress wanted rocky hillside that could not be farmed and held no obvious value. The second deed was dated March 1986, 3 years after the Gulf Coast purchase, 18 acres in Georgia wetlands that flooded seasonally and required special permits for any development purchased for $1,500 from an estate sale where nobody else bid because nobody else saw purpose in owning swamp. Both properties had been held in the same trust that contained the Gulf Coast land. Both had Genevieve's name added in 2003 when she was 12. Both had generated only property tax bills for decades. No income, no development, no attention from anyone, including Genevieve, who had not known they existed until the Mobile law firm contacted Lawrence to inform him that additional trust assets had been identified during the process of settling property disputes related to adjacent parcels. Lawrence watched her examine the deeds with the expression of someone who already knew what they would reveal. Lola bought 3 properties over 5 years, all of them in locations nobody else wanted, all of them because her compass pointed to those specific spots. The Gulf Coast land was not luck or accident. It was pattern. Have these been surveyed? I took the liberty of commissioning preliminary analysis while we waited for the deeds to be delivered. Lawrence produced a second folder, this one containing geological reports, formation data, mineral rights verification. The Alabama property sits above a natural gas formation, not as valuable as the Gulf Coast oil but worth approximately $400 million at current market rates. The Georgia wetlands contain rare earth minerals, the kind used in electronics manufacturing, worth somewhere between $600 million and $1.2 billion, depending on extraction costs and market demand when development begins. Genevieve set the reports beside the deeds. 3 properties purchased for a combined $3,500 over 5 years by a woman who could not read maps but trusted compasses more than experts. 3 properties now worth a combined $17 billion in mineral rights that would sustain multiple generations of Whitmore descendants with wealth that could fund education and entrepreneurship, and the kind of security that Lola had never experienced but had ensured her granddaughter would inherit. She knew. The realization settled into Genevieve's bones with the weight of truth that explained everything that had seemed random. Lola bought 3 properties in 5 years, following a compass to locations nobody else valued. She couldn't have known the specific geology, but she knew the compass was pointing to something that mattered. She trusted that enough to spend money she could not afford to lose on land that made no sense to own. Lawrence nodded. Your grandmother understood something most people never learn, that the most valuable things are often the ones nobody else recognizes as valuable yet. She bought land nobody wanted because nobody wanted it. And she was patient enough to wait for the world to catch up to what her compass had already told her. What do we do with this? The same thing you did with the Gulf Coast property. We secure the Mineral Rights Commission, full geological surveys, structure partnerships with capital providers who can fund development, and we ensure that every document has your name on it and nobody else's. Lawrence's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had spent 40 years waiting for a client who understood that building empires required patience and precision rather than speed and spectacle. Lola spent $3,500 in 5 years building a $17 billion inheritance. You can afford to spend the time to do it right. Genevieve stood, walked to the window, looked out at Atlanta, stretched beneath her city that had watched her build and lose and build again, geography that had witnessed her transformation from bright-eyed 18-year-old to 39-year-old who owned more than most of its residents combined and had earned every dollar through competence rather than inheritance. The evening light caught Lola's bracelet on the desk behind her, thin gold, glowing with the warmth of metal that had absorbed decades of body heat, and intention object that mattered not because of its composition, but because of what it represented. A woman who worked 42 years, carrying plates to people who did not see her as fully human, who saved every dollar she could spare, who bought land nobody else wanted because compasses pointed north and north was north regardless of what direction everyone else believed was valuable. Genevieve touched the window glass, felt heat from afternoon sun stored in material designed to insulate against Georgia summers, and she thought about Thaddeus in a federal prison library, reshelving books about Cordelia preparing for trial that would determine whether she spent her 70s in prison or under house arrest, about Sloane trapped on an island that had seemed like paradise until paradise became cage. She thought about the 400 people at the Obsidian Grand who had watched her sit at table 12 and assumed she was the dismissed wife, the woman who had lost the person whose story was ending while Thaddeus's story continued. They had been wrong about that, along with everything else they assumed about quiet women who build empires in silence and reveal them only when revelation serves purpose. The best revenge isn't destruction, Genevieve said to the city beyond the glass, words forming thought that had been building for 6 months. It's becoming so powerful that their opinions no longer matter. Thaddeus destroyed himself. Cordelia destroyed herself. Sloane destroyed herself. I just held up the mirror. Lawrence joined her at the window, 2 people who had spent years building something that finally belonged to the person who had actually built it. Your grandmother would be proud. Genevieve picked up the compass from her desk, felt brass warm in her palm, watched the needles swing north with the certainty of physics operating beyond human interference. She would say that north is north even when everyone else is facing south. She would say that sometimes the most important thing is knowing which direction you're actually facing instead of which direction you wish you were facing. And which direction are you facing now? Genevieve looked at the deeds, at the geological surveys, at the reports, projecting $17 billion in mineral wealth that Lola had identified with instruments that cost less than a decent dinner. She looked at the office that housed Whitmore Energy, at the contracts that represented clients who valued her expertise enough to follow her wherever she worked, at the future that had seemed impossible 6 months ago and now seemed inevitable. North. Same direction I've always been facing. It just took everyone else a while to notice. The sun set behind Atlanta's western skyline. February night giving way to August evening. Winter transformed into summer. The way loss transforms into strength when given enough time and enough patience and enough faith that compasses point toward truth, even when truth is buried beneath earth that nobody else thinks is worth examining. Genevieve Eloise Whitmore, 39 years old, owner of $17 billion in mineral rights, founder of Whitmore Energy, granddaughter of a woman who had trusted compasses more than expertise, stood in her office overlooking the city where she had lost everything and built everything, and learned that the difference between those two states was often just a matter of waiting for the world to catch up to what quiet women had known all along. That north was north. That deeds mattered more than promises. That the woman sitting at table 12 owned more than everyone at the front tables combined. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was sit quietly while other people announced their own destruction, then stand up when the time came and show them what power actually looked like when it belonged to someone who had earned it rather than stolen it. The compass needle swung north steady and certain, pointing toward everything that mattered and away from everything that did not, just like it always had, just like it always would.